In 5th place, we have the case of Anneliese Michel. She grew up practicing Christianity in Bavaria, West Germany in the 1960s, where she attended Mass twice a week. When Anneliese was only 16, she suddenly blacked out at school and began walking around in what her friends and family described as a trance-like state, and she herself was unable to recall any of it. A year later, Anneliese experienced a similar occurrence where she woke up in a trance after her body went through a series of convulsions, causing it to shake uncontrollably. After this, Anneliese visited a neurologist who diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy, a disorder that causes seizures, loss of memory, and experiencing visual and auditory hallucinations. After her diagnoses, Anneliese began taking medication for her epilepsy and enrolled in the University of Würzburg in 1973. Now, if that medication was successful, I wouldn't be talking about her right now, would I? The medication she was given failed to help her, and as the year progressed, her condition deteriorated. She began to see the face of the devil wherever she went, and constantly heard demons whispering in her ears. When she heard the demons telling her she was damned and would rot in hell while she was praying, she concluded that the devil himself must be possessing her. Anneliese sought out priests to help her with her demonic possession, but all the clergy she approached rejected her requests, saying that she should seek medical help and that they would need the permission of a bishop to do anything. Now at this point, Anneliese's state had become extreme. With the knowledge that she was possessed consuming her, she constantly ripped the clothes off her body, compulsively performed up to 400 squats a day, crawled under a table, and barked like a dog for 2 days. Hey, who needs a gym, right? She also ate spiders and coal, bit the head off a dead bird, and licked her own fluids from the floor. Oh, I'm not queasy, why do you ask? Finally, she and her mother found a priest, Ernst Alt, who believed in her possession, stating that she didn't look like an epileptic. If I'm taking this with a grain of salt, I'd like to know what his definition of an epileptic looks like. Anneliese wrote to Ernst, "I am nothing, everything about me is vanity. What should I do? I have to improve. You pray for me. I want to suffer for other people, but this is so cruel." Ernst petitioned the local bishop, Bishop Joseph Stang, who eventually approved the request and granted local priest Arnold Renz the permission to perform an exorcism, but ordered that it be carried out in total secrecy. Now, being granted an exorcism in the 70s was like winning the lottery. They were very rarely granted due to the sensationalism caused by the release of The Exorcist, and the Catholic Church was determined to protect their reputation. Reputation at the time. Fine, reputation on exorcisms at the time. I know, it's the church. Over the next 10 months, following the bishop's approval of Anneliese's exorcism, Ernst and Arnold conducted 67 exorcisms, lasting up to 4 hours per session on the poor woman. Absolutely heinous. Through these sessions, Anneliese revealed that she was possessed by 6 demons, Lucifer, Cain, and Nero, amongst others. And that just there was how I learned that Nero was more than just a former Jeff Hardy gimmick. Weird middle name to give a kid. All these spirits would jostle for control of Anneliese's body and would communicate from her mouth with a low growl. The demons constantly argued with each other, with one being quoted as saying, "People are stupid as pigs. They think it's all over after death. It goes on." And another replying that the first was nothing but a big mouth who had no real say in hell. Throughout these sessions, Anneliese would frequently talk about dying to make up for the wayward youth of the day and apostate priests of the modern church. She broke the bones and ripped the tendons in her knees from continually kneeling in prayer, and I just felt that statement in my own ballet-worn knees. Ouch. Over these 10 months, Anneliese was frequently restrained so the priest could conduct exorcism rites. She slowly stopped eating and eventually passed from malnutrition and dehydration on July 1st, 1976 at only 23 years old. In 4th place, we have the nuns of Loudun and Louviers. Louviers? My French is 50-50 right now. Time to hop in my little time machine and head back to 1642 when 18 nuns became possessed. Father Mathurin Picard, the nunnery director, and Father Thomas Poul, the vicar at Louviers, were convicted on the evidence of the possessed nuns' recounts. The youngest of the group, being only 18 years old at the time, Sister Madeleine Bavin, was the initial possession victim. Her testimony was successful in throwing the church into a state of panic, alleging that Fathers Picard and Boule had taken the nuns to secret sabbats. At these gatherings, they became familiar with numerous demons, specifically including the demon Damon. Try saying that without tripping over your tongue. Nah. Testimonies quickly followed from the other nuns, reinforcing Madeleine's claims, and after further investigation from the church and its authorities, it was discovered that the nuns were suffering from the classic symptoms of possession. The exorcism rites that followed were made public, enabling the entire town of Louviers to become totally engrossed in the church and its proceedings. After the exorcisms, Madeleine was imprisoned for life, Father Boule was burned at the stake, and the corpse of Father Picard, who had already passed, was exhumed and burned. Moving into the 17th century, in the French village of Loudun, an entire convent of Ursuline nuns were possessed by a series of demons with names such as Leviathan, Astaroth, and Zabulon. These nuns appeared during a series of trials that accused the parish priest, Urbain Grandier, of having made a pact with Satan. Photos of the signed pact still exist, with autographs from the devil and the previous mentioned demons possessing the nuns. In a series of public trials and exorcisms, these nuns barked, screamed, convulsed, and spoke in devil language. These sights led to a public hysteria that ultimately ended in Urbain being burnt at the stake. The events of the Loudun possessions were turned into a book by Aldous Huxley called The Devils of Loudun in 1952, which was then adapted as the 1971 film The Devils. Anyone want to have a movie night?
Number 3. Nikolai Zhumagaliev, the Metal Fang. Nikolai was born in 1952 in the Soviet Union. He went to railway school before being conscripted into the Soviet army. After his service ended, he tried to go to university or become a driver, but failed at both. He worked various odd jobs, including that of a sailor, a forwarder, an electrician, a bulldozer operator, and a firefighter. He spent a lot of this time fantasizing about and planning murders, committing his first in 1979 on a woman he had encountered traveling across a rural path. He committed 5 more murders that year, whose victims he then cannibalized, and may have committed more if not for the fact that one night he got extremely drunk and accidentally shot one of his co-workers. He was arrested, diagnosed with schizophrenia, and sent to a mental institution. He was released less than a year later, and he resumed his murders, committing 2 more. His 9th murder is what resulted in him being captured, as he had invited guests over to his home. He brought one of the guests into a different room, killed them, and began dismembering them with an axe. The other guests walked in on this and fled the scene before calling the police. They came to get him, but were so shocked at the sight of him that he managed to escape before being captured the next day. He was declared insane and incarcerated in a mental hospital where he remained for the next 8 years. In 1989, while being transferred to a different hospital, he managed to hijack the vehicle and escape. He was able to avoid capture for 2 years, killing at least 1 more person while at large, before he allowed himself to be caught stealing sheep. His hope was that he would not be recognized and could go to jail for a relatively minor offense. The story he gave the officers didn't add up, and a colonel familiar with the case was sent to check the situation out. He identified Nikolai, and he was sent back to a mental hospital where he remains to this day. Number 2. Ted Bundy. The most well-known of the monsters on this list, Ted Bundy was a cold-hearted murderer who would feign injury in order to get close to women and then attack them into unconsciousness in order to take them to a secondary location where he would take advantage of them before strangling them to death. He would often return to the bodies of the victims where he would subject the corpses to further indignities, for decomposition made this impossible. He later confessed to 30 murders, but the authorities believe his real body count is likely extremely larger. In one of the first examples of computers being used to investigate serial killer crimes, authorities compiled all the information they had based on witness statements to come up with likely suspects, and the computer produced a list of 26 names, one of them Bundy's. At the same time, detectives made a list manually of their 100 best suspects. When Bundy's name appeared on both lists, he became their number 1 suspect, but word came out that he had already been arrested. A highway patrol officer had seen Bundy cruising a residential area and fleeing upon seeing the police car. When searched, they found a crowbar, handcuffs, a ski mask, rope, and an ice pick, among other suspicious items in Bundy's car. He was soon linked to and found guilty in a kidnapping case until the authorities gathered more evidence to charge him with the murders. In Utah State Prison, he attempted an escape and was placed in solitary confinement for several weeks before being transferred to Garfield County Jail. He was then taken to the Pitkin County Courthouse, where he chose to act as his own attorney. This allowed him to avoid having to wear handcuffs and shackles, and during a court recess he was allowed into the court library to research his case, where he snuck away from his guards and fled through the library window. He made his way to an Aspen hunting cabin, which he broke into and stole food and a rifle from. He became lost in the mountains and eventually found his way back to Aspen, where he stole a car but was soon apprehended by authorities. He was sent back to prison where he acquired a hacksaw blade and spent 6 months sawing a hole in the bars in his window. He squeezed through the gap and into the crawl space, which led to the chief jailer's apartment, where he stole clothes and walked right out the front door. During the 2 months of freedom following his second escape, Bundy managed to kill 2 sorority girls and 1 12-year-old girl before eventually being arrested for driving a stolen car near the Alabama state line and being sent back to prison where he remained until his eventual execution. Number 1. Earl Nelson. When Earl Nelson was 2 years old, his parents died and he was sent to live with his grandmother and her 2 younger children. Even from his young childhood days, he exhibited self-loathing and morbid behavior, being expelled from his primary school as a 7-year-old. He got even worse after being hit by a streetcar and being knocked out for almost a week. Upon awakening, he began to suffer from intense headaches and memory loss, and his behavior became more and more erratic. He was in and out of prison as a young adult for relatively minor charges such as trespassing and larceny. He eventually ended up in Los Angeles County Jail, where he remained for 5 months before escaping and joining the Navy. He was committed to the Napa State Mental Hospital by a Navy psychologist who described him as living in a constitutional psychotic state. The doctors at the institution described him as suffering from hallucinations and paranoid delusions, but they deemed him relatively harmless. In his time at the hospital, he managed to escape 3 times, causing the staff to nickname him Houdini, and eventually stopped searching for him. He was sent back to the hospital after trying to assault a minor, but escaped 2 more times before eventually being discharged in 1925. The next year, he began his string of murders. He would travel the country pretending to be a harmless traveling Christian, looking for women with rooms to rent. He would then be invited into the women's homes, whereupon he would assault and murder them by strangling them. Not always in that order. A witness who saw him near the scene of the crime described him as a dark and stocky man with long arms and large hands, causing the newspapers to begin calling Earl Nelson the Gorilla Man, or the Dark Strangler. He managed to cross the country, killing at least 16 women, as well as 2 of their children, before making his way to Canada to avoid the growing manhunt. While in the country, he killed 2 more people before authorities were able to track him down and arrest him at a nearby train station. He escaped from the prison that very same night and boarded a train going south back into the States. The train happened to be carrying several members of the local police force, who recaptured him and took him back to prison. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Although he tried to appeal this for reasons of insanity, he was hanged in Winnipeg in early 1928 at the age of 30 years old, after killing at least 23 people and having escaped incarceration on 7 separate occasions.
Number 5, Joseph Mengele. I'm just gonna get this out of the way now. This man is the only entry from the Second World War on today's list. And that's mainly because, well, like I said before, online guidelines make it practically impossible for me to talk about the evil German dictator or members of his party. Also known as the Angel of Death, Dr. Mengele was an anthropologist and SS physician who conducted numerous inhumane medical experiments on the prisoners in Auschwitz. He was born on March 16th in 1911 in the Bavarian city of places I cannot pronounce, Germany, and was the eldest son of Karl Mengele, a manufacturer of farming equipment. Joseph studied medicine and physical anthropology at several universities. In 1935, he earned a PhD in physical anthropology from the University of Munich, and in 1936 he passed the state medical exams. In 1937, he began working at the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt, Germany. There he was an assistant to the director, Dr. Ottmar von Verschuer, a leading geneticist known for his research on twins. So under that doctor's direction, Joseph completed an additional doctorate in 1938. He was particularly interested in twins, as twin research was seen at the time to be the ideal way to determine how the environment or human heredity influenced the human body. At Auschwitz, he was one of a number of medical professionals who selected victims to be sentenced to the gas chambers, or to be spared for his experimental research. He would attempt red fluid transfusions from one twin to the other, do amputations and try and sew it onto the other twin, stitch 2 twins together to form Siamese twins, infect one twin with typhus or another disease, and way too many other experiments. To the surprise of no one, more often than not the twins died during the procedures, or he would have them killed afterwards just so he could do an autopsy for funsies. If one twin died from a disease, he would often kill the other as well to mark the differences between the sick and healthy subjects. The evil doctor was also very interested in heterochromia, where people have irises of different colors, and he would collect eyes and body parts of his victims and send it through for research. He would inject chemicals in victims' eyes to attempt to change their eye color. Nowadays, we just use contacts. I have a whole collection. He also experimented on pregnant women before sending them off to the gas chambers and caused incestuous pregnancies, always under the guise of research. He tried sex change operations, removing organs, and operating on victims without anesthesia. And if all that wasn't wild enough, he tried to prove that Jewish and Romani people were genetically inferior through his morbid experimentation. Throughout his time at Auschwitz, Joseph sent his colleagues in Germany red fluids, body parts, organs, skeletons, and fetuses that had been taken from prisoners. He managed to escape imprisonment after war, first by working as a farm stableman in Bavaria, then by moving to South America. He later moved to Brazil, where he met up with another former Yahtzee party member, Wolfgang Gerhard. In 1985, a multinational team of forensic experts traveled to Brazil in search of Joseph. They determined that a man named Gerhard had died of a stroke while swimming in 1979, and dental records later revealed that Joseph had, at some point, assumed Wolfgang's identity and was the stroke victim. Number 4. Paul Bernardo. Okay, I'm cheating a little bit on this one, since I'll be covering both Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. If you don't believe that she's just as twisted, if not more so than he is, wait till the end of this and see if I can't change your mind, because my stomach is already turning. If a lawyer is willing to be disbarred by revealing what was told to him in confidence, that's pretty telling in my book. So Paul Kenneth Bernardo is a Canadian serial killer and more, who was dubbed the Skullgirl Killer and other monikers I can't say thanks to the interwebs hating the R word, and together with his former wife, Karla Homolka, one half of the Ken and Barbie killers. So Paul was born in Scarborough, Ontario on August 27th of 1964, the third and youngest of Kenneth Walter Bernardo and Marilyn Elizabeth Bernardo. So Kenneth Sr. often sexually took advantage of Paul's older sister Deborah in front of other family members, and would eventually be charged with crimes involving voyeurism and P-word crimes. If you need elaboration on any of the words I can't say today, I assure you someone in the comments can help. Marilyn Bernardo often withdrew from her family due to depression and agoraphobia, eventually moving into the basement. Paul presented himself being, a happy and well-adjusted youth, despite his family's dysfunction, and was an active member of the Boy Scouts. Beneath the charming facade, however, he gradually developed pyromaniac inclinations and dark sexual fantasies, one of which involved creating a virgin farm where he would breed virgins to take advantage of sexually. And here I thought I dodged a bullet when it came to my ex that had people-munching fantasies and was way too into My Little Pony. Later in life, Paul was diagnosed with sexual sadism, voyeurism, narcissistic personality disorder, and met the requirement for a diagnosis of psychopathy. So, that checks. After a fight between his parents when he was in high school, Paul was informed by his mother that he was the result of an extramarital affair and that Kenneth was not his biological father. Repulsed by all of this, Paul began to call his mother a salute, and she reciprocated by calling him a bastard from hell. Later, after growing weary of Bernardo's domineering behavior, his first girlfriend left him for one of his friends, and in retaliation, he set fire to all of her belongings that he could find. Between 1987 and 1990, Bernardo committed increasingly vicious sexual crimes in and around Scarborough, attacking most of his victims after stalking them as they got off buses late in the evening. Oh yeah, I totally feel safe right now. From May to September of 1990, Toronto police submitted more than 130 suspect samples for DNA testing and received 2 tips pointing to Bernardo. So they interviewed him on November 20th for 35 minutes, and he voluntarily provided DNA samples for testing, but was not arrested at this time for any of those crimes. During this time frame, he met and got engaged to Karla Homolka, and that's when things escalated from sexual crimes to killings. While there are 3 notable killings, I'm just gonna talk about the one that disturbs me the most for time purposes. So although he was engaged to Karla, Paul had become obsessed with her younger sister Tammy, peering into her window and entering her room to get himself off while she slept. Karla helped Bernardo by breaking the windows in her sister's room, allowing him access. According to Paul's testimony at trial, Karla laced spaghetti sauce with crushed Valium she had stolen from her employer in an animal clinic. She served it to her sister, who soon lost consciousness, and Bernardo then did icky things to Tammy while Karla watched. After a minute, Tammy regained consciousness, and it only gets worse from here. 6 months before their 1991 wedding, Karla stole the sleeping pills from the clinic, and on December 23rd of 1990, Karla and Paul administered said pills to Tammy in a rum and eggnog cocktail. When Tammy lost consciousness, Karla and Paul undressed her, and Karla applied a halothane-soaked cloth to her sister's nose and mouth. Karla wanted to give Tammy's virginity to Paul for Christmas, since according to her, Paul was disappointed that he was not Karla's first sexual partner, and the duo also had a video camera on hand for the experience. You can't make stuff like this up. Tammy began to vomit. They tried to revive her and called 911 after hiding evidence, dressing Tammy and moving her into her bedroom, but she never woke up. Despite being observed vacuuming and washing laundry in the middle of the night and, evidence of a chemical burn on Tammy's face, the regional municipality of Niagara coroner and Carla's family accepted the couple's version of events, that Tammy had just choked on her vomit after consumption of alcohol. After Tammy's death, Paul and Carla videotaped themselves engaging in sexual intercourse, with Carla wearing Tammy's clothing and pretending to be her. Thankfully, now Paul is in jail for the rest of his life, but Carla is out in public, living alone in Salaberry de Valleyfield. In third place, we have John Jenkin, who also happens to be the most recent case on this list. In the summer of 2013, 25-year-old John from Cumbria, England, expressed fears that he would kill his mother. If it was just a fear, you can't relate some days. Well, in his deranged state, he approached a random van driver, put his hands in the air in a surrender motion, and cried out, "I am armed, but it's not in my hands." Desperate to avoid committing such an atrocity, John tried to end his life by downing a cocktail of whiskey, painkillers, LSD, and attempting to end himself in a river. He was discovered later that day, unstable, and smeared with his own red fluid after self-inflicting. After these events, John was admitted to a psychiatric hospital, where staff judged him as low risk and released him. I'm no expert, but I'd hate to see high risk if that's considered, minimal? Later that evening, he confessed to a group of friends that he was possessed by demons, stating, "I am the devil, I need to confess." He said his mother had become aggressive and controlling after the events of that day. And that same night, his sister Katie had confided in one of her own friends that she was really worried about her brother, saying that he didn't seem like her brother and he didn't look like her brother anymore. The next morning, after a brutal argument with his mother and sister, he went downstairs and hit his mother with lots of blows to her head with a sharp end of an axe, and when his sister came downstairs, he attacked her as well to stop her from screaming. I guess the sister was sadly right to be worried. Now, after the killings, John was found stark naked, crouched behind a bench, acting erratically. When a police officer asked him if he had taken anything, he simply replied, "Lives." A court has since sentenced him to a minimum of only 12 years in prison. In second place, time to meet Michael Taylor. In the 1970s, Michael Taylor was largely an ordinary figure in the town of Ossett, Yorkshire. He, his wife Christine, their 5 children, and their pet poodle lived peaceful and happy lives. And now to, pop that Stepford Wives bubble. In 1974, Christine stated to a Christian fellowship group to which they both belonged that his relationship with the leader of the group, Marie Robinson, was carnal in nature. Michael admitted that he felt evil within him and eventually attacked Marie verbally, who screamed back at him. Marie stated that his eyes changed to something bestial and that he began to speak in tongues. Michael had no memory of the event, something all too common in cases of possession. During the next meeting, he received an absolution, but his behavior continued to become more erratic. As a result, the local vicar called in other ministers experienced in deliverance in preparation to cast out the demons residing within the man. The exorcism, which occurred between the 5th and the 6th of October 1974 at St. Thomas's Church in Gobber, was led by Father Peter Vincent, the Anglican priest of St. Thomas's, and was aided by a Methodist clergyman, the Reverend Raymond Smith. Over the next 8 hours, Michael would repeatedly have crucifixes stuffed inside of his mouth while being doused with holy water. Okay, now my jaw hurts. According to Bill Ellis, an authority on folklore and the occult in contemporary culture, the exorcists believed that they had, in this all-night ceremony, invoked and cast out at least 40 demons, including those of incest, bestiality, blasphemy, and lewdness. In the end, exhausted, they allowed Taylor to go home, although they felt that at least 3 demons were still left in him. While at home, he brutally ended his wife, Christine, by attacking her with his bare hands, tearing her eyes and tongue out, and almost tearing her face off. He was eventually found by a policeman, completely naked in the street and covered in red fluid. At his trial in March, he was acquitted on the grounds of insanity. He was sent to Broadmoor Hospital for 2 years, then spent another 2 years in a secure ward in Bradford before being released. I'm seeing some repeating factors here, are you? Finally, in first place, we have Arne Cheyenne Johnson, otherwise known as the Devil Made Me Do It. Now, before I talk about his exact crime, we have to explain how he came to be possessed. Satan originally possessed David Glatzel, the 11-year-old brother of his fiancée, who was living with the couple. Strange happenings first began in the summer, when young David would jolt awake in the middle of the night, sobbing in fear after being visited by a hideous creature that he described as a man with big black eyes, a thin face with animal features, jagged teeth, pointed ears, horns, and hooves. The beastly apparition had issued a warning. Beware. Very quickly, the visions amplified, with David's beast now haunting him during the daytime. Each time the child experienced a visitation, Deep scratches would appear on the front door of the family's home, and red marks would appear on David's body. Thankfully, everyone in the household believed his claims. According to his sister Debbie, it was out of character for him to lie, describing that he never liked anything spooky, not even scary comic books. Becoming increasingly worried for young David, a priest was summoned to bless the house, but that accomplished a big fat nada. The possession had escalated to such heights that the family were now taking shifts to monitor him during the night. Eventually, the involvement of paranormal investigators, some of my favorite people to discuss on this channel, Ed and Lorraine Warren, was begged for, and luckily for the family, they were available. With her strong powers of clairvoyance, Lorraine described encountering a black misty form during her first meeting with David, knowing immediately she and Ed were dealing with something of a negative nature. Lorraine has stated over the course of several visits, David made numerous references to ending in stabbings. In an attempt to save David from his endless tormentors, Arn taunted the demons during exorcisms to enter his body and leave the boy alone. And sadly, the challenge was accepted. Look, I'm all for saving kiddos, but there's a limit. You don't want to actually invite the demons into your body. Over many months after that fateful day, Arn's fiancée reported that he would go into a trance, where he would growl and say he saw the beast, and later would have no memory of it. It was 6 months later, on the 16th of February, 1981, shortly after 6 p.m., that Arn brutally attacked his landlord, stabbing him in a frenzy as he growled like a beast, while Debbie watched, unable to react. The landlord passed away later that evening. At his trial, Arn pleaded not guilty to the ending charge, with his defense being the demonic entity which inhibited his body had caused him to do it.
Number 5 on this list is Edward Edwards. Edward Edwards, for those who don't know, was an American serial killer who did most of his killing from 1977 to 1996. He has 5 confirmed kills to his name, however he's suspected of several additional murders that were never solved. Edward always had an affinity to crime. In 1955, he actually escaped from jail and went around America robbing gas stations and was at large for 7 years. He became so well known that he actually earned a spot on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list at the time. He also refused to disguise himself during these robberies because he claimed that he wanted to become famous. Eventually, in 1962, he was found and brought in. He was sent to jail, but didn't actually spend too long there considering what he had already done. He was out on parole in 1967, which, as we'll later learn, was a horrible idea. The first known murders that Edward committed were in 1977 when he killed William Lavico and his girlfriend Judith Straub. They were both very young, and he took them out into the woods and shot them both with a shotgun. 3 years after this incident, he murdered 2 people again. This time, the victims were named Tim Hack and Kelly Drew, and instead of being shot, they were stabbed and strangled. Then in 1996 was his last confirmed murder, that of Danny Law Glockner. This was actually Edward's foster son, and he admitted to killing him for the life insurance policy of $250,000. In an interview, Edward very matter-of-factly owns up to killing Danny and shows zero remorse at all. He goes on to say that he was a schemer, and he'd always been a schemer and was looking for a way to earn a quick buck. He said that he had planned this thing for over a year and had been preparing everything for that long. In the interview, he very carefully lays out everything that happened and does it in a manner that it seems as if he's almost boasting about it. He even talks about how he took his head and threw it into a forest a year later after animals had bitten it off, and he doesn't even blink. Edward Edwards was an extremely sick and twisted man who clearly was not capable of feeling any normal and healthy human emotions. He died in prison back in 2011. Number 4 on this list is Tommy Lynn Sells. Tommy Lynn Sells is right up there as being one of the worst serial killers of all time. The acts that he committed were so gruesome and just plain evil that I can't even begin to understand the level of inhumanity that it would have taken to do it. He was only convicted for 1 murder, which he received the death penalty for, but authorities believe that he committed upwards of 22. Tommy Lynn Sells was known for murdering mothers and their... He didn't just stop with them though, also killing the fathers from time to time, but there was definitely a bit of a pattern involved with the mothers. In an interview that he had while he was still alive, he comes up with a sick and twisted reason as to why he did this.
I know what I went through as a child. The nightmares, the drama, the reality of who I was and what was done to me. I never wanted that to happen to another person.
Tommy Lynn Sells argues that he killed children to put them out of their misery.
I don't even know if there are adjectives in the English language to describe how messed up that is. Tommy Lynn Sells was eventually executed on April 3rd, 2014.
Number 3, Vlad the Impaler. Also known as Vlad Dracula, he was the Prince of Wallachia 3 times between 1448 and his death in 1476 or 77. The character of Dracula was loosely based on Vlad due to his sadistic personality and cruel acts done to the people of Wallachia, where he reigned as prince 3 times between 1448 to 1462 and killed about 20% of the population. Works containing the stories about Vlad's cruelty were published in Low German in the Holy Roman Empire before 1480. The stories were allegedly written in the early 1460s because they describe Vlad's campaign across the Danube in early 1462, but they do not refer to Mehmed II's invasion of Wallachia in June of the same year. So the stories about Vlad's plundering raids in Transylvania were clearly based on eyewitness accounts, because they contain accurate details including the lists of churches raided by Vlad that were destroyed and, the dates of the raids. They describe Vlad as a demented psychopath, a sadist, a gruesome killer, and a masochist worse than Caligula and Nero. One tale explains that Vlad had a big copper cauldron built and he put a lid made of wood with holes in it on top. He put people in the cauldron and put their heads in the holes and fastened them there. He then filled it with water and set a fire under it and let people cry their eyes out until they were boiled to death. And then he invited frightening, terrible, unheard of punishment. He ordered that women be impaled together with their suckling young on the same stake, stuck on their mother's breasts until they died. Then he had the woman's breasts cut off and put the little ones inside head first, thus he had them impaled together. He impaled victims through the buttocks until the stake came out of the mouth. A German pamphlet once read that he had young folks roasted, and then he fed them to their mothers. And he also cut off the breasts of women and forced their husbands to eat them. Yeah, nightmare cruelty. Number 2, Joseph Stalin. If I had a nickel for every time I've mentioned an evil Joseph today, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that happened twice, right? So this man was dictator of the Soviet Union from 1922 until his death in 1953. As a young man, he was a robber and an assassin, so simply, bad guy stuff. For almost 30 years, he reigned with terror and violence. His decisions led to a famine that killed millions. Stalin promoted Marxism and Leninism abroad through the Communist International and supported European anti-fascist movements during the 1930s, particularly in the Spanish Civil War. In 1939, his regime signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, enabling the Soviet invasion of Poland. Stalin's necessity for the Soviet Union's economic development has been questioned, and it has been argued that his policies from 1928 onwards may have only been a limiting factor. So Stalin's Soviet Union has been characterized as a totalitarian state, with Stalin as its authoritarian leader. Various biographers have described him as a dictator, an autocrat, or accused him of practicing Caesarism. He's also been labeled a red fascist. Heck, forget enemies, he even killed families of people who were fond of him. Under his rule, more than 1.5 million German women were sexually harmed, and all in all, he easily killed over 20 million people. He once said, "One death is a tragedy. A million deaths is simply a statistic." In the mother of all what the bleep sentences, he was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize in 1945 and 1948. Number 1, Jim Jones. As if I was going to do a list of the worst people in the world and not include a single cult leader. In the 1950s, Indiana native Jim Jones founded the People's Temple, a group that he claimed promoted socialism and equality with religious elements of Christianity. Initially, he was, not much more than a charismatic hustler who faked faith healings by having audience plants pull chicken livers out of congregants' mouths. But as the years progressed, he demanded more and more of his followers. In the early 1970s, he moved his group to California and set them up in a commune-like settlement in Redwood Valley. After he established several locations throughout the state, including its headquarters in San Francisco, the temple forged ties with many left-wing political figures and claimed to have 20,000 members, even though 3 to 5,000 is a little more likely. Jones eventually came to believe that nuclear war was imminent and moved his followers again to the South American country of Guyana, which he thought would be outside the potential danger zone. The group lived there for several years as the People's Temple Agricultural Project, but after former members started speaking out against the church, San Francisco Congressman Leo Ryan decided to travel to Jonestown to investigate claims of bad things. During his visit, a number of temple members expressed a desire to leave with him and accompanied Leo to the local airstrip at Port Kituma. There they were intercepted by self-styled temple security guards who opened fire on the group, killing the congressman, 3 journalists, and one of the defectors, as well as injuring 9 others, including Ryan's aide, Jackie Spire. A few seconds of the incident were captured on video by NBC cameraman Bob Brown, one of the journalists killed in the attack. That evening in Jonestown, Jones ordered his congregation to drink a concoction of the cyanide-laced, grape-flavored Flavor Aid. Oh yeah, so this is where the phrase drinking the Kool-Aid originates, but it was actually Flavor Aid. All in all, 918 people died, including 276 minors. When members wept and showed signs of dissent, Jones counseled, stop these hysterics. This is not the way for people who are socialists or communists to die. No way for us to die. We must die with some dignity. On a tape, he can be heard saying, "Don't be afraid to die," adding that death is just stepping over into another plane, and a friend. So Jones directed that the youngest folks be killed first. His wife Marceline apparently protested against this. She was then forcibly restrained, but eventually joined the other adults in poisoning herself. Some members resisted ending their lives and were injected with fatal doses of cyanide, as were those too young to drink the drink, and some others survived by fleeing through the jungle. Until 9/11, it was the largest loss of American civilian life in history, which sends a chill down my spine to talk about.
Number 5 on this list is Thomas de Torquemada. This is a name that is often forgotten. Thomas isn't often talked about in the same conversations as some of the other people on this list. He didn't kill as many people as some of the other people here, but don't think for a second he wasn't as evil. Had he the means to do so, he assuredly would have killed far more people than he did, and he still killed a ton. Next, Luxury writes, the first Grand Inquisitor, Thomas de Torquemada, was a religious zealot. Like many in Spain during the 14th century, he believed Catholicism was the one true religion, and anyone who disagreed had to be punished. The Spanish Inquisition was established to help combat heresy, but actually helped solidify those in power who ruled through fear and violence. De Torquemada was one of the nastiest members of the Spanish Inquisition who used brutal torture methods to get confessions from prisoners. He was also responsible for burning thousands of non-believers at the stake. It wasn't even enough for you to convert to Catholicism, this guy would still come after you even if you did. If he thought you converted because of fear or some other reason he deemed unfit, then he'd force you to wear certain garments and torture you. Heretics would get waterboarded and then often killed afterwards. He saw to the expulsion of over 40,000 Jews from Spain as well. He kicked them out, only allowing them to leave with what they could carry, having to abandon their homes and their livelihoods. On top of this, he killed thousands of people too. This guy was absolutely messed up and would do anything in his power to keep Catholicism alive in Spain. I guarantee that if you lived in Spain during the 1500s, then this guy would definitely have been haunting your dreams. Number 4 on this list is Osama bin Laden. I think we all know this name, and I wouldn't be shocked if some of you have already been haunted in your dreams by it. Next, Luxury writes, unlike many of the other evil people on this list, Osama bin Laden wasn't responsible for the deaths of millions. He was officially held accountable for the deaths of 2,977 people. What makes him such a detestable individual was that the murders came about as a result of the September 11th attacks. This remains the deadliest terrorist attack in human history. The legend of the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden was behind the planning of the horrendous attack on American soil. It took 10 years for the American government to find him, finally discovering him hiding out in a compound in Pakistan. An assault on the home was undertaken and bin Laden was shot on site, ending one of the longest manhunts and bringing some closure to those impacted by the September 11th attacks. This is the biggest terrorist attack in history that we are talking about here, guys. One that shook America and the entire world when it happened. I would have been too young to remember it at the time, but most people you talk to can remember where they were and what they were doing when they heard the news that this happened. I can't imagine having that much hate inside yourself to want to do that to so many innocent people. But that was what Osama bin Laden had. He was filled with hate. He ruined the lives of so many people, and for that reason, he has to make this list. Number 3 on this list is Bernard Giles. Bernard Giles is currently serving several life imprisonments for killing 5 between September and November of 1973. He was only 21 years old when he committed these crimes and had a wife and a child at the time. He would get in his vehicle and drive around on highways looking for young women who needed a lift. These hitchhikers would get into his car, and before they knew what was happening, Bernard would strike. In the clip that I'm about to show you, Bernard is far older. A lot of years have passed since he's been imprisoned, but here he tries to recount his first killings.
That day that you went out, when you did kill for the first time, was that a morning when you woke up and you were with your wife and daughter and something hit you and you went,
No.
today may be the day?
Every day may be the day.
Every day?
Every day may be the day.
So there are multiple things about that clip which makes it one of the most chilling to me. I think what really gets me though is how he talks about every day being the possible day. Literally at any point, without warning, these serial killers could snap and then go on a rampage. And they don't even remember who it was that they killed. At least we know that Bernard Giles will be spending the rest of his existence locked behind bars. Number 2 on this list is Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was one of the most ruthless and prolific serial killers that we've ever known. He targeted young women in the 1970s and confessed to killing over 30 of them. How many women he actually killed is unknown, but the number is thought to be significantly higher than that. He engaged in all types of sick and sadistic stuff, things that I can't get too deep into on YouTube because they were just simply that bad. A member of his own defense team even came out and said Ted was the very definition of heartless evil. Whenever your defense team is coming out and saying that, you know that there's no redeeming you. Bundy died back in 1989 by means of state-sanctioned electrocution. Before he was executed though, Ted Bundy had one final interview. This interview took place in the evening of the day prior to him being executed. Watching this man who killed so many people and knowing that he's going to be executed the following day, there's just this cloud of darkness just that hangs over the whole interview. Ted Bundy described what it was like to kill someone by saying, "I want you to understand what happened. It was like coming out of some kind of horrible trance or dream. I can only liken it to being possessed by something so awful and alien, and then the next morning wake up from it, remember what happened, and realize that basically in the eyes of the law, and certainly in the eyes of God, you're responsible." Now everybody, he may sound almost remorseful in that little excerpt, but do not be fooled. This was a man who had intercourse with the dead bodies of the people he killed. There was truly not an ounce of good in this man at all. Number 1 on this list is Manuel Vela. The crimes committed by Manuel Vela actually happened not too long ago, which makes this whole story that much more scary. Manuel was a 28-year-old man who only a few years ago killed his girlfriend, who was 39 weeks pregnant with his child. Like guys, we are talking about just some of the most sick and twisted stuff ever. After he was finally apprehended, an interview took place. In that interview, he says that the only reason he was with his girlfriend all this time was to eventually kill her, and he had told her this time and time again.
Why did you stay with her?
Oh, to kill her.
So that was your only purpose this whole time?
Yes, yeah, kill her.
And you made it pretty clear to her that that was your whole purpose as well?
Yeah. Told everybody, hey, I'm gonna kill you, right? I'm telling him to kill her.
So apparently this guy had been telling her about this for years and was planning it this whole time. This is just some insane stuff that is honestly hard to break down. I have no idea how anyone could get to this place or what would cause something like this. Manuel Vela ended up taking his own life in January 2017. Number 5 on this list is Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong wanted China to become a superpower, but how he went about it wasn't the best. Loss of life to Mao Zedong really wasn't of much importance to him as long as the end goal was achieved. The BBC writes, Mao and other communist leaders set out to reshape Chinese society. Industry came under state ownership and China's farmers began to be organized into collectives. All opposition was ruthlessly suppressed. The Chinese initially received significant help from the Soviet Union, but relations soon began to cool. In 1958, in an attempt to introduce a more Chinese form of communism, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward. This aimed at mass mobilization of labor to improve agricultural and industrial production. The result instead was a massive decline in agricultural output, which together with poor harvests led to famine and the death of millions. The policy was abandoned and Mao's position weakened. In an attempt to reassert his authority, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966, aiming to purge the country of impure elements and revive the revolutionary spirit. 1.5 million people died and much of the country's cultural heritage was destroyed. In September 1967, with many cities on the verge of anarchy, Mao sent in the army to restore order. It was in this great leap forward that Mao's rule cost the lives of millions. He wanted to change China into an industrialized nation and implemented tons of unproven agricultural methods. This dropped the food output significantly and led to the Great Chinese Famine. This famine is largely regarded as the deadliest man-made disaster in human history, so yeah, it was pretty bad. Unlike others on this list, Mao for the most part wasn't infatuated with the deaths of citizens, it was just a byproduct of his incompetency and horrible rule. Granted, we can't let him off too easily because he also didn't care that much to change his way of thinking. During his reign of power, it's estimated that 40 to 70 million Chinese civilians died through forced labor, executions, or famine. Number 4 on this list is Nero. We're throwing it way back with this one and going to the year 37 AD. That's when Nero was born and he lived until 68 AD. Only just over 30 years of life, but he did enough during that time to earn himself a spot on this list. Wikipedia writes, most Roman sources offer overwhelmingly negative assessments of his personality and reign. The historian Tacitus claims the Roman people thought him compulsive and corrupt. Suetonius tells that many Romans believed that the Great Fire of Rome was instigated by Nero to clear land for his planned Golden House. Tacitus claims that Nero seized Christians as scapegoats for the fire and had them burned alive, seemingly motivated not by public justice but by personal cruelty. This personal cruelty of his is widely documented and nobody was safe from it. One would think that your own mother would be on the do not kill list, but apparently not for Nero. To rid himself of any potential outside influences, he had his own mother murdered. He's said to have stabbed, burned, boiled, impaled people for his own personal pleasure. Couple this with the fact that he's said to have burned down entire cities while people are still inside of them, and you get a horrible tyrannical dictator who, I'm sad to report, actually did exist. Number 3 on this list is Idi Amin. Idi Amin was a horrible individual who was brutal in every sense of the word. He overthrew the government in Uganda in 1971 and was in power there until 1979 when he was finally ousted. During his time in power, he showed the world just how horrifically evil he was. History.com says, once in power, Amin began mass executions upon the Akoli and Lango Christian tribes that had been loyal to Obote and therefore perceived as a threat. He also began terrorizing the general public through the various internal security forces he organized, such as the State Research Bureau and Public Safety Unity, whose main purpose was to eliminate those who opposed his regime. In 1972, Amin expelled Uganda's Asian population, which numbered between 50 and 70,000, resulting in a collapse of the economy as manufacturing, agriculture, and commerce came to a screeching halt without the appropriate resources to support them. Throughout his oppressive rule, Amin was estimated to have been responsible for the deaths of roughly 300,000 civilians. One of the worst parts about all of this is that he never had to pay for these heinous acts. After he was ousted in 1979, he fled to Saudi Arabia and just lived out the rest of his life there under protection. He lived comfortably there after having caused so much pain and death just years prior. He lived like this for decades until he finally died in 2003 from natural causes. Idi Amin doesn't get nearly as much media coverage as he should. The atrocities that took place in Uganda during the 70s need to be talked about more and must be acknowledged. Millions of people during that time would have been living in total fear of this man. I think it's fair to assume he probably still haunts the dreams of those who had to live through this terrible trauma. Number 2 on this list is Joseph Stalin. Stalin is another one of those guys who just has to be on this list. His name is synonymous with evil and hatred and death. Next Luxury says, much like Hitler, Joseph Stalin was loved by his supporters and hated by everyone else. The dictator governed the Soviet Union from 1922 until his death in 1953. His communist identity was influenced by Marxism-Leninism, resulting in his own idea known as Stalinism. Throughout his rule, millions died, particularly during the famine of 1932 and 1933, thanks to his disruption of the economy. Stalin was also responsible for the Great Purge, where a further 1 million were imprisoned and around 700,000 executed. To this day, Stalin supporters revere him as a champion of the working class, looking past the ethnic cleansing and mass executions that happened during his time in power. Stalin's horrifying exploits are often overlooked because just a little further down the line, you do have the whole Adolf Hitler thing. Stalin was right up there though as being just as brutal. The way he treated the Ukrainian people was absolutely horrific. He starved them for the sake of starving them. We cannot have another one of these these individuals in our world ever again. We barely made it out the first time that we had one.
Kicking this list off, we have Frankenstein. Okay, not really the Dr. Frankenstein that we know and love, but the man who Mary Shelley based the novel off of, and around. Well, one of them at least. Mad scientists are still puzzled by the works of one Johann Conrad Dippel. Dippel was born at Castle Frankenstein in Germany, where he would attend university as a philosopher. He studied theology, philosophy, and alchemy at the University of Gießen, obtaining a master's degree in 1693. In the 1700s, he then turned to Hermetic studies and alchemy, and this is where it gets a little mad scientisty. There are claims that during his experiments at Castle Frankenstein, he practiced alchemy and anatomy at the same time, on both the living and the deceased. Yeah. Creepy. Dippel even said that the rumors were true that he had sold his soul to the devil in exchange for secret knowledge. Yeah, that'll do it. He had a huge reputation surrounding dark sorcery, specifically for his work around the Philosopher's Stone and his claim to fame, the elixir of life. He performed experiments with cadavers and attempted to transfer the soul of one to another. Yeah, he was obsessed with this idea of soul transference with barely and freshly dead people. Common experiments among alchemists at the time though. One night apparently while he was working with nitroglycerin and the effect on magnetism and electricity apparently led to the destruction and a huge explosion at Castle Frankenstein. It was this night that he apparently was messing around with lightning and the answer to all his ailments came to him. Local mythology and lore recounts huge explosions and lightning emitted from the castle that night. I guess this was a pretty infamous night. It seems like it's right out of the book, no? Apparently this was the night he acquired the knowledge behind creating the elixir of life, his pride and joy. So what exactly happened that night at Castle Frankenstein? Huge lightning storm, or was this guy opening portals looking for souls? You tell me. Number 4, electro. Okay, they were definitely onto something back then. Lots of magnets and souls and electricity going on. It's 1803. Giovanni Aldini was an Italian physician and physicist born in Bologna, Italy. He, just like the other Dr. Frankenstein, liked to conduct high amounts of electricity through corpses to see what they could do. Yeah, sinister stuff. But science, you know? They like to do these crazy experiments and then write it down and stuff. Lab coats, you know. I have a weak stomach. I could never have sat through these experiments. Since electricity was relatively new at the time, all these zany ideas from these mad scientists multiplied the more playing around with it. Soon, it became otherworldly. The obsession around electricity, magnets, souls, other realms, they were hypothesizing leading to some pretty evil stuff. In 1803, the fresh body of a murderer was pulled down from the gallows of Newgate Prison in London and taken to the Royal College of Surgeons for experimenting. There, before an audience of doctors and physicists, Giovanni attempted to breach realms and return the corpse from beyond the grave. Ooh, okay. Homemade batteries and magnets was used, which made the deceased muscles contort aggressively, and apparently his eyes even opened, looking around the room. Giovanni then stuck the rod where the sun don't shine, then made the whole body start to move about as if it had come to life. For years, he was the leading scientist in electricity and its effect on the body. Apparently, some claim that Aldini would even experiment on himself, pushing the limits and dialing up the voltage. Dude, this guy's Electro from Spider-Man. In recognition of his merits, the Emperor of Austria made him a Knight of the Iron Crown and died not many years later. And although he was unsuccessful at bringing souls back from the dead using electricity, I'm sure this guy experienced more than he shared. I wonder who has his journal.
Number 3 on this list is Pol Pot. Wikipedia writes, Pol Pot was a Cambodian revolutionary and politician who governed Cambodia as Prime Minister of Democratic Kampuchea between 1976 and 1979. Ideologically a Marxist-Leninist and a Khmer nationalist, he was a leading member of Cambodia's communist movement, the Khmer Rouge, from 1963 until 1997 and served as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Kampuchea from 1963 to 1981. Under his administration, Cambodia was converted into a one-party communist state and went through the events of the Cambodian genocide. The Cambodian genocide is something that we don't learn about enough in history class. This genocide claimed the lives of at least 1.5 million Cambodian civilians from 1975 to 1979. 1.5 million is already a ridiculously large number, but it should also be noted that in 1975, this would have accounted for roughly a quarter of the entire country. Pol Pot and the party that he led during this time wanted to turn Cambodia into an agrarian socialist republic. At the time, Mao Zedong was in charge of China and Pol Pot went to him for advice on how to make this a reality. To do this, he emptied out cities and forced people into labor camps where they were either executed or simply worked to death. Disease and malnutrition was also rampant in these camps and the quality of life was horrible. Money was abolished and everybody was forced to wear the exact same black clothing, stripping people of any sense of their individuality. This truly was a horrible time in Cambodian history and saw so many atrocities committed countrywide. It finally ended when the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia in 1979 and Pol Pot's government fell. He lived for roughly another 20 years though, finally dying in 1998. Number 2 on this list is Joseph Stalin. Ekharsh Merota writes, Joseph Stalin was dictator of the Soviet Union from 1922 till his death in 1953. As a young man, he was a robber and an assassin. For almost 30 years, he reigned with terror and violence in the Soviet Union. His decisions led to a famine that killed millions. Forget enemies, he even killed families of people who were fond of him. Under his rule, more than 1.5 million German women were assaulted, and in all, he easily killed over 20 million people. He once said, "One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is simply a statistic." Ironically, he was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize in 1945 and 1948, and he died of a stroke in 1953. That famine that I just mentioned frankly does not get talked about nearly enough. Wikipedia writes, the Holodomor, also known as the Terror Famine or the Great Famine, was a famine in Soviet Ukraine from 1932 to 1933 that killed millions of Ukrainians. It was a large part of the wider Soviet famine of 1932-1933. The term Holodomor emphasizes the famine's man-made and allegedly intentional aspects such as rejection of outside aid, confiscation of all household foodstuffs, and restriction of population movement. As part of the wider Soviet famine of 1932-1933, which affected the major grain-producing areas of the country, millions of inhabitants of Ukraine, the majority of whom were ethnic Ukrainians, died of starvation in a peacetime catastrophe unprecedented in the history of Ukraine. Since 2006, this has been recognized by Ukrainians and 15 other countries as a genocide of the Ukrainian people carried out by the Soviet government. This was a famine that could have been prevented or dealt with, but just wasn't. It was actually intentional. There are reports of survivors who said that soldiers would come to their homes and specifically destroy any food that they had there for no reason. Stalin truly was void of emotion, and it's sad that a man like this actually existed.
Coming in at number 5, Michael Taylor. It's 1974, Yorkshire, England. Michael Taylor, age 31, father of 5 and husband to Christine Taylor. Michael was a well-mannered and caring father and husband. Michael, like anyone, became depressed from a back injury, left him short on work and seeming a little odd and off. After seeking religious advice and a one-on-one session at a local church, Michael started having outbursts and acting aggressively. Puzzled, he sought one-on-one sessions which turned ugly. After apparently changing form and attacking Marie, a young religious leader helping Taylor and unable to remember anything, Michael and the church agreed that an exorcism was necessary. Father Peter Vincent and Reverend Raymond Smith met at St. Thomas and started. It got so violent, he was tied to the church floor. After hours in the middle of the night, the two had managed to exorcise more than 40 demons out of Michael, in which appeared around them as they exited. Violence continued, leaving only 3 demons remaining for the next day. After returning home from the first session, Michael was found now only hours later, naked, in the middle of the street, covered head to toe in blood. Michael had returned home, to which then his wife and family dog lay dead as the police arrived in the AM. His wife, missing her eyes, tongue, and skin from the front of her skull. The dog, torn limb from limb and spread around the home. He was arrested soon after for the death of his wife. Michael had this to say about his late wife in court, quote, "I am released. I am released. It is done. The evil in her has been destroyed." Yeah, that was definitely a vessel for him. He was acquitted on psychological conditions, and jury found that he met his breaking point during the exorcism that night. He was acquitted on insanity and remained in and out of facilities until he passed in 2013. Number 4, David Berkowitz. New York, 1976, and the police were busy on the search for a man shooting couples in the New York area, which had started to become a citywide phenomenon that summer. Brunette women with long hair frantically cut and dyed their hair blonde in fear. The .44 caliber killer was the title the press gave David in his earliest of assaults. After losing his job, David began to experience psychotic episodes and claimed that his neighbor's German Shepherd had begun talking to him and eventually explained to David that he was a demon. He took the name after the pet's owner, Sam. It was this dog who ordered the killings by David and claims that the pet coaxed David into killing. David used this summer to shoot 8 people, resulting in 6 lives and the stabbings of 2 others. Using his .44 caliber bulldog revolver, David sent police on a wild goose chase around New York City with handwritten letters, David mocking the detectives with cryptic messages. Some of them explain who Sam is, and some of them explain what Sam does. Some mock police, saying that they are never going to find or stop him. David was finally arrested just hours before his next planned victim's visit. He applauded police in their ability to stop him, in the back seat of the car, laughing and cheering. Although David pleaded not guilty to insanity and pleaded guilty, expressing that he was coaxed by the demon and that it demanded him to kill for hell. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences with parole after 25 years. During the mid-90s, he amended his confession and claimed that he had been a member of a violent satanic cult that orchestrated the incidents as ritual murder and pleaded guilty to stabbing and attempting to murder others before the shootings had even begun. His letters are public and spine-chilling. Check them out. Real Riddler stuff. Quote, "I am the monster. I am Beelzebub. I am the chubby behemoth. Police, let me haunt you with this. I'll be back. I'll be back. Yours in murder, Mr. Monster." Okay, his violent spree led the legal system to create a new law called Son of Sam's Law, designed to create criminals from financially profiting from the publicity created by their crimes, which at the time, he was basically a celebrity. He remains in prison to this day. Number 3, no, I'm Spartacus. Actually, much more evil than him. Heinrich Müller, born in Munich, Germany, April 1900. After serving as a pilot in World War I, he joined the police in Munich, soon acquiring a reputation as a skilled investigator. As such, he would draw the attention of 2 nastier men, Heinrich H. and Reinhard H., leaders of the German SS army. Yeah, I don't even like saying their full names out loud. Just Google them up, you'll know. Müller entered the SS in 1934 and quickly rose through the ranks of the organization as a police official. In 1939, when the Gestapo police force and the other organizations joined the Reich, Müller was made head honcho. Yeah, basically this guy was like next in charge to you know who. He was a pretty scary and powerful guy. Müller was involved in a ton of criminal affairs. He helped plan the Polish attack, he signed the Bullet Order, he authorized the torture of officers who had conspired to kill other SS soldiers. People knew him and knew of him. He was, unfortunately, infamous and a huge deal. This is the weird part. When the Allies moved in and they arrested him, the man turned out to be another Müller. Okay. In fact, they couldn't find the Heinrich Müller, instead arresting many others of the same name. The head of the Gestapo wanted for crimes against humanity had vanished without even a trace. Gone. Even the CIA were like, okay, where the hell did this guy just go? He was just right here. He apparently vanished in the last days of the war. The Western Secret Services started many investigations over the years, but Müller and the vast majority of the Gestapo secret files were never found. In 2001, the CIA reopened its archives about the SS war criminal and revealed it still knew nothing new or conclusive about the SS Heinrich Müller, who had been in charge all those years ago. Where did this guy vanish to? I don't know. Number 2, us. Sure, I've had my fair share of sibling rivalry. One's better at this, one's better at that. But these siblings took it to a whole other realm. The Han twins, or as I like to call it, the story of good versus evil. A tale as old as time. Well, not that long ago, actually. During the 90s, this was a huge case plastered on every screen of the attempted murder of Sunny Han by her identical twin sister, Gina Han. Whoa. It's November 6, 1996 in California. It quickly became a jaw-dropping case in the media as the case touched on themes of broken families, sister rivalry, split personas, and of course, parallel universes. The sisters had always had disagreements, but apparently hatred became obsession. Throwing some hands here and there became stalking, and eventually jail time. The older they got, the more things escalated. Gina, after escaping prison, had drummed up the idea to hire 2 teenagers to kidnap her sister. Uh-oh. During the kidnapping, the plan, however, failed, and the 2 men were quickly taken into custody by police. Just before going to Sunny's apartment, they went to buy large garbage bags, duct tape, wine, gloves, Pine Sol cleaner, and magazines. Yeah. The police were notified and luckily reached them before Sonny's evil plan could commence. And it was a close one. They, including the evil sister, were locked and loaded. Literally. Scary. Yeah, as in she literally dodged a bullet on that one. This is like the Metal Mario version of yourself, isn't it? This is terrifying. Do you even think you could take an evil version of yourself? It's sad that it's family, you know? The jury reached their verdict as to each defendant on November 20th, 1997, and Han was convicted of all charges, which were 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder, 2 counts of burglary, 2 counts of false imprisonment, and 1 count of possession of a weapon. So why did she hate her sister so much? How come she wanted to take over her life and just live one? This has evil parallel universe written all over it, dude. And number 1, the gods. Peru contains its fair share of ancient megalithic ruins. I'll do it again, sorry. Peru contains its fair share of ancient megalithic ruins. If you're not familiar with the construction and myths behind the Machu Picchu and the Nazca lines, then this next one may make you scratch your head. Some would say those are cute compared to this next rock? I don't know. The door in Hayumarca, some think it's a wall, but most believe it becomes a portal to the beyond. The story of the Gate of the Gods, also known as Door of Hayumarca, begins near the banks of the Titicaca over half a millennium ago. According to Incan legend, the universe began here, and according to researchers, the Incan Empire fell here, somewhere around 1592. Peruvians tell the tale of an Incan priest who barely escaped slaughter from the conquistador forces. His name was Aramu Muru, and he was a powerful high priest who served in the Temple of the Seven Rays. To escape his imminent death at the hands of the Spanish army, Muru fled to Hayumarca with the help of other priests, and using a golden disc key, Muru opened the small door in the face of the rock, apparently venturing into another realm. According to legend, the stone door transformed into a bright tunnel that was lit with an unearthly blue light. Aramu Muru passed through the barrier and entered the void, upon which the door then closed behind him. Spooky. Many people believe that he is now living in the land of the gods. Many still believe he is to return with the knowledge of the other side. I mean, if this guy just like platform 9 3/4 himself through a perfectly sanded rock face, yeah, I'm gonna say it's ancient aliens. Right away, 100%. This site's also been said to be aligned by 5 other archaeological sites, which together form an imaginary cross with straight lines crossing each other exactly at the point where this plateau and lake are located. That makes it even creepier.
Number 5, Randy Greenawalt and Gary Tyson. As a 2-for-1 bonus for our viewers, our first entry on this list details the imprisonment, escape, and brutal rampage of 2 prisoners from the Florence State Prison in Arizona, USA. In 1974, Randy Greenawalt and his brother James were held on suspicion for the murder of a truck driver named Stanley Sandage. The brothers had shot the driver and taken his wallet before being arrested when they tried to purchase stereo equipment with the victim's credit card. The authorities realized that the killing was extremely similar to the death of another driver, Henry Weber, 4 days earlier. The 2 brothers were charged with the murders, but Randy was able to avoid the death penalty by testifying against his brother. He was sent to Florence State Prison, where he met Gary Tyson. Tyson had attempted to escape several times and was serving a life sentence for stabbing a prison guard. The 2 men formed a plan together to try and escape with the help of Tyson's 3 sons, who showed up to visiting day with a concealed shotgun and helped the 2 prisoners to overpower the guards and escape, with plans of escaping to a ranch in Mexico. They quickly ran into trouble when their car blew a tire. A kind stranger driving with his wife, infant son, and teenage niece came across them and tried to see if they needed help. They were taken prisoner by the convicts and taken into the desert, where they were shot and left for dead, while Greenawalt and the Tysons fled in the family's Mazda. They made contact with a woman Greenawalt had become pen pals with, who bought them a truck and ammunition, plans of making their way to an airplane that Gary had chartered for their escape. The police caught wind of this, and the gang was forced to try and make alternate arrangements. They made their way to Texas, where they killed a couple of newlyweds and took their car. Days later, they were met with a roadblock, which they ruthlessly barreled their way through, before being met with another one 6 miles down the road. The officers opened fire on the gang, hitting one of the Tyson sons who was driving. The remaining 2 brothers and Greenawalt were captured, but Gary Tyson got away, although he was found dead in the desert 11 days later, having died a slow death of exposure to the elements. The brothers were sentenced to life in prison, and Gary was executed by lethal injection after spending 2 decades decades on death row. Number 4. Lyda Southard, the Black Widow. While not all marriages end well, and some can accurately be described as unmitigated disasters, few have ended as poorly as the various marriages of Lyda Southard. But, for all her faults, no one can say she didn't take the vow of till death do us part seriously. Lyda married her first husband, Robert Dooley, in the year 1912. For a while, it seemed a good match, with Dooley's brother Edward joining them on their ranch in Twin Falls, Idaho, and the couple having a daughter named Lorraine 2 years later. When she was a year old, Lorraine suddenly died, having apparently drunk tainted water from a dirty well. Tragedy struck again later that year when Edward died of food poisoning. 2 months after that, Robert died of typhoid fever, and Lyda was left the only surviving family member. Fortunately for her, she had taken out life insurance policies on each of her family members and had over $4,500 to try and start over after this tragedy. She soon married William G. McCaffell, becoming the stepmother to his 3-year-old daughter. When his daughter fell ill and died, the couple decided to move to Montana together, but within a year, William died of influenza, leaving poor Lyda a widow once again. Bad luck seemed to follow her wherever she went, with her next husbands, Harlan C. Lewis and Edward F. Meyer, both dying of sudden illnesses within 4 months of marrying Lyda. A relative of her first husband started to notice the pattern and had his family's corpses exhumed and examined, proving that all had died of arsenic poisoning. The other bodies showed the same results when tested, and Lyda was arrested before she had a chance to murder her 5th husband, Paul Southard, for the insurance money. She was sentenced to 10 years to life in the old Idaho State Penitentiary, where she remained as a model prisoner for the next 10 years. The guards eventually stopped watching her as closely as they should have, and in 1931 she managed to remove a bar from her prison window and use her bed sheets to construct a rope in order to escape. She remained at large for over a year until she was found in Topeka, Kansas, married to her 6th husband, Harry Whitlock. She was taken into custody for another 10 years before being released in 1941. She died of a heart attack in 1958, whereupon her 7th husband, Hal Shaw, likely breathed an unconscious sigh of relief.
Number 3. Herbert Mullen. 1970s again. At the exact same time, in the same area, police had 2 serial killers to keep up with, Herbert Mullen and Edmund Kemper. No relationship to each other or each other's cases. Mullen was a paranoid schizophrenic in and out of mental health facilities in California during his teens. Mullen then kills 14 people during a 4-month period due to, quote, the impending natural disaster that would happen if he didn't. Mullen was convinced that the voice in his head he was hearing was telepathic. Mullen claims the voice of the Father had explained that the Vietnam War acted as a giant sacrifice that saved us from an earthquake and another one was coming soon. Constantly hearing the man's voice named the Father, encouraging him to gain more blood sacrifices, Mullen bludgeoned a man to death with a baseball bat. Mullen claims that the man was actually Jonah from the Bible and was begging him to sacrifice himself to Mullen. He then murdered a woman in the front seat of his car before dismembering her in a nearby park. Yeah, this is real satanic stuff, I told you. His 3rd victim, a priest that he was confessing to in a Catholic church. Mullen says the priest claims to have telepathically begged him to sacrifice his life for the cause. Mullen then killed 5 people in 1 day. He claims that all the victims telepathically begged to be sacrificed as a good deed to the Father. Herbert Mullen remains in custody, and who was the father who kept talking to him through all of these people? Number 2, Richard Ramirez. This next guy is really nasty and deserves to be in the 2nd spot. 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 assault, and 14 burglaries. Sounds like a hell of a guy. The Night Stalker. Charming name for what this man did. Born in Texas, his older brother went to Vietnam and returned with some pretty gruesome stories and some pretty gruesome visuals. The young Ramirez, soaking all of this up, grows up obsessed with the satanic occult and fascinated. He made various references to Satan during his legal proceedings. His trial began in 1989 and he was convicted of 13 murders and a variety of other crimes. Nearly 2 months later, he was sentenced to death, with the judge stating that his crimes showed, quote, cruelty, callousness, and viciousness beyond any human understanding. And the worst part was that he made most of his victims pray to Satan and swear on Satan that they were going to tell him the truth, whatever he asked. I'm not really going to get into the sick details of really what this man did, nor will I with the number 1 spot, but it involved hammers, machetes, ropes, knives, guns, you name it, anything violent. He was an absolute nasty creature that liked to torture his victims and really drive the satanic love for you-know-who. First responders would have taken pictures of numerous satanic symbols drawn on the walls in almost a ritualistic reenactment. He was captured by the use of the huge media surrounding his story on the way to take his next victim's life. His trial was truly a disgusting display of media attention, one of the most expensive court cases to date, losing only to O.J. Simpson. He screamed "Hail Satan" at his hearing and flashed self-harm pentagrams. He died of cancer in 2013. This guy must have signed some sort of book for you-know-who. Coming in at number 1, Charles Manson. Okay, so most of us are all familiar with this man and his famous case amongst American pop culture. Ramirez was said to have been a copycat of this man, and I can see why with all the satanicness. California in the late 1960s. A criminal, musician, and a victim of LSD studies, Charles Manson would go on to start and lead the Manson family cult. A small religious group with unclear motives but lost souls and a ton of drugs, and a father to now a family. In summer 1969, some of the cult members committed murders in LA. Apparently Manson had ordered his followers to kill the people who had lived at the address he had given them for their initiation. The murder of actress Sharon Tate and 4 others in her home on August 8th and 9th, including the La Biancas the next day. Another 2 victims. 4 members of the family committed the murders under Manson's instructions and satanic offering. Manson apparently heard voices that there was going to be a race war brought on by religious disputes, and that these killings were an offering to... who exactly? The famous helter-skelter message, incoherent scribbles, blood all over the walls. They were then to hide underground in, quote, the bottomless pit under Death Valley, which Manson knew the location of, but instead were caught on the run days later. Manson was sentenced to life in prison under the pretense that he was the one who targeted, planned, and brainwashed his, quote, piggies into committing. While in prison, Charles was diagnosed with schizophrenia and paranoid delusion disorders, seeing visions and hearing voices for more than half of his life. He died in prison in 2017. Yeah, I've seen what Tarantino did with his latest movie, and it's definitely a subtle PG-13 fiction version of what actually went down on that night. What do you guys think? Do you think Charles saw the devil? I think he actually was the devil.